I specifically said, look, everybody has a right to express their, individual personhood, but what you don't have the right is to ask me to celebrate and coddle your personhood.
I think eventually there is a path there where you come around to understand that it's not because Christianity recommends, X, Y, and Z, but it's through Christianity that we become great.
And of course, this upends the whole purpose of becoming parents, which is that the world stops and is no longer about you. I mean, that's why you grow up and you have kids and you have responsibilities. And
they passed the anti-alt-right resolution, which is basically to say they condemn racism, but they only condemn whites who happen to be racist. And of course, by their definition, all whites are racist unless they have a sufficient amount of self-hatred.
Today, white people are constantly being told that race is a social construct. It's not even biological. It's some sort of sociological optical illusion.
You get someone who's just a global citizen, and they might well be mixed race, which is part of it, that adds to it. And you think, where do you belong? Yeah, you belong in a shopping mall. There's nothing to you other than that.
Thank you for having me on, Matthew. I'm pleased that I have the opportunity to enjoy this and look forward to the good work you're going to do in the future.
Oh, sorry about that, guys. Yeah, I tried to mute myself so I didn't interrupt the video, the cool new features. So hopefully that should be okay now. And it's a tradition on this podcast. Tradition, we've had a pilot episode, so tradition being one, it's tradition to begin with a prayer, and so I'll do that now.
Amen.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for this opportunity to talk about nationalism and our people and our culture. And we know that many who have come before us have struggled and accomplished things far greater than we could ever dream of. And so it is with humility that we come before Thee today to speak on these difficult issues, but to understand that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. And we thank Thee for bringing Tom here today, and for all of the guests joining us today in the audience and in the chat. So we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So now, Tom, how are you doing? People didn't hear the introduction, so Tom Kawczynski is an author and a writer, and I think a former politician, apparently. He's also got a website, nationalright.us, and I've been following him on various podcasts, and we're pleased to bring him on today for an interview.
Sure, I'll give people who don't know me the 5-cent introduction. So, I was previously the town manager of Jackman, Maine about a year ago, and I was fired for taking an anti-Islam, pro-Western culture, pro-white position, for which I have landed on the ADL hate list, the SPLC hate list, and personally had the Washington Post and New York Times fact-check my blog. Hello. But since then, I've been working as a pro-white activist to work for the cultural renewal of our people. I've written 3 books now since then, one called Someone Had to Say It, The Hidden History of How America Was Lost, which talks about cultural Marxism in America over the last 100 years, The Coming Civil War, which profiles the likely conflicts ahead, and my latest book, which hopefully will be coming live on Amazon tomorrow, is called After Trump, and it's a review of nationalism and how it offers solutions to some of the problems we're facing. So that's what I've been doing, and as you said, I've had the opportunity and pleasure of appearing on a number of podcasts, including your wonderful show. So thank you for having me on.
That's great. Yeah. Well, we could dive into. You mentioned Trump, and I know you've got an article up there featured on your website, how civic nationalism failed, and I just wanted to read a little clip because I thought it was very good. You said, "Identity politics are here to stay, and as much as Republicans will choose to signal against this, so long as the Democrats organize, govern, and agitate as such, unless our success is absolute, an unwillingness to engage on the same level only ensures our identity is further denuded and unable to compete. We must assert our values and our heritage, both American and Western, with equal force and vigor to compete. This is why we exist outside the GOP. We are the people who see what is coming and do not constrain ourselves to one set of solutions when it comes to issues as important as preserving our family and our beloved nation. Nationalism isn't dead. This idea, it can be all things to all people, is, and good riddance." Now, I think we have to kind of be delicate about, saying we want to put our eggs into, politics, or we want to put our eggs into culture. I mean, the two, it is kind of a cycle that reinforces itself. And I do think that Donald Trump has galvanized people, and he's brought, he's brought this optimism to the table, possibly to our detriment, because people were, looking at Trump as some kind of savior almost. And he's certainly not that. But I think that just because of the nature of politics, for most people, it doesn't do us much good to, put our faith in Trump. No, we want to put our faith in God. We want to put our faith in actually moving the needle of this culture war, which, as they say, culture is downstream from politics. And well, what do you tell people who want to be, want to support nationalism, because it does seem like you sort of have to pick an option now in this day and age. You either have to go the politics route and be super careful with what you say, or you have to try to push the boundaries and the culture a little more. So do you think it's the case that people have to pick one or the other?
I think it has been the case, but that in the very near future it will not be. I think one thing that Trump demonstrated amply with his election in 2016 is there are a range of political solutions out there that people were not willing to consider in the establishment media, and that we were told were not valid. For instance, Trump's statement about the border wall in and of itself was something no Republican or Democrat would have touched seriously. However, we see that there was a mandate for this, enough for him to defeat 16 Republican candidates and defeat probably one of the best supported candidates ever in Hillary Clinton. So what I would say to people is I think that there is an evolving understanding that the cultural values we care about require a new brand of politics to be successful. And Trump might not be the fulfillment of that promise, but he's a harbinger. So think of him as a sort of John the Baptist, if you want to use a biblical metaphor, for something much bigger on the horizon. And the thing I think it will be is identity politics coming to the right. Because the reality is the Democratic Party has demonstrated once again in the 2018 midterms how they use identity politics to succeed, how California has been completely turned, Arizona lost a Senate seat, and Texas was nearly turned, which was always seen as a Republican bastion, but due to Hispanic migration in, as well as a number of black people moving from New Orleans post-Katrina, that's changed the whole dynamic. So while I think that if someone wants to be a political candidate, they probably have to keep their powder a little dry, so to say, I think the idea that there is a massive division between what we need culturally and what we need politically is false. And I would also note that the problem that conservatism had broadly wasn't a lack of defense of moral value, but the unwillingness to put government in service of its own political beliefs, trusting that civil society would be sufficient to resist the encroachment of government, which we saw was not the case, because now, since people pay taxes for what were essentially leftist designed programs to dictate culture, the rightist alternative of civil society is in decline, at the same time that we see the people who do determine culture, like we see in the media, like we see in the universities, essentially has become a leftist echo chamber, which we have been struggling amongst ourselves in the movement to contest. As you said, I've had the opportunity and pleasure of hearing on a number of podcasts, including your wonderful show. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm hearing some background noise. I wonder, is that coming from me? It might be, actually.
Is that better? Did I get rid of it?
I think it's gone now. It might have been me, actually.
Okay.
I apologize. Anyway, yeah. Yeah, this. Well, you know, the positive aspect is things are so different now than they were 2 years ago or 3 years ago that it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to go back to where we were. And I think that's definitely a good thing. I do go back and forth because sometimes Trump's relentless focus on the economy or whatever, I get angry, and people like Ann Coulter get angry, and that she's tweeting at him, "What about the wall? What about the wall?" And a lot of us, I think, especially in this, we're single issue voters. It's all about immigration, but I do go back and forth because the more economic stability we have, the more time it buys us. The flip side of that, though, is that economic stability, if you don't have strong borders, that's going to attract more migrants to your country, like a honeypot sort of thing. So
well, let's take the example of Ronald Reagan, right, who was lionized by the Republican Party for being a period of stability and for economic growth. But in reality, when you look at what he did with the, I believe it was the 1986 amnesty, which basically legalized, I think it was about 8 to 10 million people, that's why California is a democratic state. So with victories like that, you can't continue fighting very long. And I think we've reached a point where immigration has become a civilizational defense issue. And I'll put it to you as bluntly as I can. Assuming that, the voting patterns by demographics stay the same, which I think we can assume, and I say that because, as Trump often says at his rallies, he's made an ongoing effort to create the lowest unemployment amongst the various different minority groups, blacks, Hispanics, Asians in history, and yet they voted in the same traditional democratic patterns. So this idea that Republicans have that they're somehow going to win the culture war by promising economic prosperity or even delivering on economic prosperity to minorities has already been debunked by the reality we've seen on the ground. Now, I might agree that if we had control over the culture and the media, that we might see a different outcome. But given that we need to deal as realists with reality on the ground, what we have to do is then make tactical decisions to make sure that people who are in America and legally allowed to vote are in fact people who are at least persuadable to the idea of voting in defense of our values. And I think the reason you see nationalism growing and honestly what was the impetus for the alt-right was an understanding that these demographic realities seem to be somewhat unchangeable, and the refusal or inability to reverse them will basically equate to having an unbreakable democratic firewall throughout the southern U.S. sometime in the 2030s, if not sooner. And so I think when we look at Trump, the thing we have to be very careful about is saying that, well, if he does well economically, that's a win, because realistically, all that means is that the sort of corrupt regime we had in Obama, whomever comes along with the next Democrat, will now have a whole bunch of money to steal and spend and redistribute. So I really put a bigger emphasis on the culture war part of this. And I would say with Trump, the verdict is still out to some extent. I think he has good instincts, but bad staff around him in terms of what they tell him is possible. And one of the things that we need to do is, rather than getting into this habit I think the movement gets into of saying he's the worst guy ever or the best guy ever, to realize that he is someone who is persuadable and is not opposed to us, and to organize our efforts in a way that helps push things to where they need to go for us to be more successful in defense of our values and our nation.
And in some ways, that's probably the best thing for us, because if we did have somebody, Trump's a negotiator, and so if we had somebody who was extremely partisan and very, how should I put this, just unwilling to work with Democrats or anything, it would constantly make Republicans feel comfortable, and then potentially that could be our downfall. And I think, like you said with Reagan, I think that was the case. It's like Reagan went over and tore down that wall. Well, he's given credit for tearing down the Berlin Wall, and people thought that they had won, basically. And I think people are just starting to realize that they've been duped this whole time. People who have been longtime Republicans their whole life, and they're starting to. You see this with the anti-war stuff too. A lot of people just. It happened slowly. Like, it wasn't a snap moment, but it just. Now it's hard to deny the fact that the Republican Party, it was not in control of everyday Americans. It was being bought off by special interests, and that's really
it's a little bit of a black pill, isn't it?
Well, it is and by design. I think a lot of when a lot of the whites switched over from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, there was this stopgap to make sure we didn't go too far. It's like, okay, well, you can have your social conservatism, the Ben Shapiro talking points about being against abortion and gay marriage. Nowadays, you can't really even have that, but at least back in the day, you could, but you couldn't. You couldn't really stand up against war. It took the libertarians to really stand up against war, and then you couldn't push back against legal immigration. And back in the day, sure, we had some illegal immigration, but nowhere near the numbers we did today. And a lot of people just they didn't think it was that big of a problem. But moreover, the people who realized were able to see into the future were hamstrung, and by Congress, by these political action committees, and it really is just like a disintegration of our electoral democracy. And I know a lot of people have problems with democracy, but my point is it was designed this way, and thankfully people are waking up, and we have social media to kind of let people realize that. And my hope is that the Republican Party isn't done transforming, that it can continue to transform. But I think also, like you, I'm not a political, I'm not, well, I actually used to just be done with politics altogether. I thought there was no hope, and so I was just sort of, assuming the crash position. But I've gained some more hope.
Well, if you want to think of it, if you want a silver lining on that cloud, think of it this way. Most of the Republicans who lost their seats were in marginal seats, and these were people who were not going to be nationalists, probably. They were more of your old school GOP establishment, free borders or free markets, open borders types. So the fact that they're gone in some ways is probably a positive. It increases polarization, but increased polarization leads to definition of what the new views are. And Trump has this need to go ahead and develop what nationalism means, and we should play a big role in that. But when you look at the history of how all this started, it really goes back a long way. You could go back to the 1910s, and if someone's really interested into that, maybe I'll come on another time. We'll talk about that in some detail and go into Someone Has to Say It. But for the terms of what you were talking about in terms of, when this changed radically, I think the end of the Cold War is really an important inflection point, because when we passed NAFTA, and when we stopped going ahead and having sort of limited, restricted borders where there was our world and their world, the first and second world, because that's where third world comes from. The second world was the Soviet sphere. It's sort of an interesting and outdated term that is stuck. You see that there were people talking about what the consequences were going to be. Pat Buchanan in 1992, who's written many excellent articles and books upon what would happen to America with population displacement. Ross Perot and his abortive candidacy, once again in 92, talking about that giant sucking sound that would devastate the American economy, and specifically the Rust Belt, which wasn't the Rust Belt then, it was still the industrial Midwest. So a lot of things were done to shift us from a national footing to a global footing. It was done with the consent and support of both Republicans and Democrats. I would say George H.W. Bush and 43 were just as responsible as Clinton and Obama. But what's interesting is, as you trace that, first the money was taken out of America, but then there's a more dark story really about the rise of cultural Marxism, where the one thing the left does is they're very good at mobilizing people to work together who probably shouldn't, based upon issues of envy and resentment. So in the 30s, they were organizing rural whites like FDR did with the Tennessee Valley administration and creating a bunch of jobs and turned the whole South Democratic. So race for the cultural Marxist is always just a means to an end. And the end for them is ultimate power. And they create new problems with each generation to create new needs for government, because government is the only institution that is the solution to its own problem. And so they can kind of rely upon this and rely upon perpetual resentment to drive and build their organization. And at this point, they have been so successful in taking control of the media, of culture, of universities, that really they are dictating the course. So it doesn't bring me joy as a moralist to be necessarily in identity politics. Nonetheless, as a defense mechanism, we're reaching a point where we need to consider reactionary solutions, in my mind, because if we allow them to control the government for just 4 or 8 more years, the demographic collapse that will happen in America is such that we will be a permanently socialist and on our way to potentially being a communist country, which, pretend white identity isn't your thing. That's fine. If you're a Christian, you should be concerned. If you're a traditionalist, if you're heterosexual, I mean, at this point, they're attacking heteronormativity, saying that, they may take your children if you say to your kids, there are just boys and girls. These sort of things are happening. So we need to be really aware of the fact that, the left will, one, do anything to get power, and two, they're at the verge of being able to have a democratically elected majority for the foreseeable future. That means either Trump needs to do something bigly, or that we need to be prepared to go ahead and offer alternatives up to and potentially including meaningful resistance against this sort of a regime. Now, I know that's heavy to say all in one conversation, but if you've studied the history of what the left does when it actually gets ultimate power, what you find are a whole lot of dead bodies in their sort of psychotic search to realize radical equality, which as naturalists we understand cannot be reached anywhere this side of the Lord's heaven,
Right, yeah. And I know that you've talked before about reaching out to normies, right? And what I'm just trying to think, in terms of that, people, let's say your average Trump supporter, because I know you mentioned just now that you don't, it's not a moral question to you, this identity politics. It sounds like it's more of a practical thing. So how would you go about bringing someone over to your side on identity politics?
I think we can learn something here from the left. I mean, on the face of it, intersectional activism sounds ridiculous. But think of it this way. How do they manage to get gays and Muslims to work together when Muslims are basically instructed by dogma to kill gays? And the answer to the question is because they both hate whites more. And whether it's whites, traditionalists, Christians, or whatnot, that's how they're able to organize. The way that I have found that you can honestly and genuinely interact with people who lean right of center, and I think we should constrain ourselves on that basis because you're not going to reach leftists, and we can talk about that more if you like. But
there's people who try. But,
well, there are people who try, including yours truly, and I lost my job for doing so. And the left had no interest in listening because they only believe in equality. And because they only believe in equality, they only believe in degradation. Because functionally, what they're forced to do because of their embrace of equality is reduce you to the level of whoever their lowest common denominator is. That's why they literally have to indulge fantasies they know very well are not true, because it goes ahead and sets a new bottom. And every time they can set a new bottom, what they become is a bigger entity. Because people who shouldn't be able to work together do on the basis of common resentment. And to some extent, that is why nationalism scares them so much and why it's so powerful. Because nationalism at root is a force of unity, but it is a force of unity that defines itself against the other. And in this case, the other are people who dislike our nation and who do not have respect for it. So we can start there at that point, have an honest conversation, and realize we all agree on about 90% of things, including the right, and this is a fundamental one, to disagree about the idea of what is perfection, but to agree that we think there are virtues and that some values to each of us have more value than others. That's one thing we can do. And the other thing we can do is clearly define a common enemy. And if we are very honest and open about that, we can say, look, we stand against cultural Marxism. We are the forces of quality, of the belief that people can be better, that man can be a moral being, against the forces of quantity that basically sees us all as mouths to be fed and people to be controlled. And I think when you present to thinking people the situation that way, they're willing to listen and answer. And I do a lot of my work as an activist. I'm actually driving around Maine today doing that. And when you talk to people that way and you're genuinely willing to listen to their concerns, what I have discovered is more often than not, there are a lot of people who are willing to work together on that basis. The challenge, of course, is waking them up to the intensity of the challenge ahead, and also having the understanding and patience that, all of us went through an awakening process. and it's going to take a little time, and being able to be patient and gentle about it, and starting with the people you know rather than trying to proselytize to a whole nation will lead to much better results. Because anytime nationalism has arisen, it's much more of an organic, gentle growth. And we need to be aware of that. And that's really where the cultural battle comes in, where even if we, are going to realize some major upheavals in a short amount of time, you can't just rush culture. And that's why it's so important for people to work on those angles and restoring, a belief in who we were and what we achieved, and arts and humanities, and to offer a cultural alternative where we can say we're not just trying to destroy things. We're not nihilists. We actually believe in something, and whatever that emerges to be will be a fusion of our past and our aspirations of the future.
Well, so okay, when you talk about like becoming better and improving, I think of meritocracy. But I'm not sure if that's what you mean by right wing, because a lot of people maybe when I said some people do attempt to reach out to the left, I guess I'm talking more about like just strictly on the economics or something like that. I think that like even the people who are left economically, like there are some of them who, the reason for doing that isn't to destroy things. It's really, I guess you could say they have good intentions, right? They want to help their fellow man, and on the right, we recognize that's probably better done with charity than government, but it's, it doesn't mean that they're completely lost. So does that sound about right to you?
Well, I think it depends on the individual. I think there's a lot of well-intentioned but naive leftists. And I would say that nationalism sort of presupposes there's a third way. I mean, if you think of it sort of really super simplistically, and I use the terms right and left, but if we're going to be technical, if you think of the right as being capitalist and you think of the left as being communist, they're both materialist, positivist philosophies that are sort of obsessed with material wealth. And nationalism has a transformative potential to flip that equation around, where we could say that our main concern is the welfare of the people, and that while we individually have preferences that lean towards a more capitalist or socialist view of things, or I should say market or socially driven view of things, that in fact we shouldn't be obsessing over the left-right paradigm as the barometer of the left and right economically, at least. And I think that's accurate. I mean, I think that that's healthy. I honestly think that, you want to promote policies that are going to help your people. I think one of the things that Trump has done that's very clever and canny, for instance, is to talk relentlessly about defending people with pre-existing conditions, or to defend Social Security as a question of fairness, that people who've paid into a system deserve that social subsidy. I mean, if we're really honest, the reason why people oppose welfare states is largely because they perceive the people who benefit from that system are not giving a fair contribution to it. So I definitely think that there's some room for maneuver on policy. I think that culturally we should be less compromising, but I think that there's plenty of room economically to have policies that help our people. And I think Trump has done very well in that regard in pointing that out. It's been an unfortunate tendency of Republicans to this point to support policies that hurt their own people and help others for fear of media labeling.
Right, yeah. Well, why don't you talk about why don't we shift to can we talk about some of the current events? Like what do you think of this UN migration pact?
I'm glad the U.S. is getting out of that refugee thing. I think it's an absolute horror. But it's globalism. I mean, if you start to study it, if you really study it, there has been an effort underway since at least the end of the Second World War to move towards a global governance. There is a great book on it that I'm reading right now. It's called American Betrayal by Diana West. And it talks about how the Roosevelt administration was prioritizing Stalin getting war shipments before American troops during World War II, or how George H.W. Bush in spy documents was literally plotting with Mikhail Gorbachev to go ahead and realize a synthesis of communism and capitalism, in the sense that they would have more of capitalism in the Soviet Union and we'd have a more authoritarian social welfare state. You see that in the European Union reaching its fruition. I would argue Russia might have gotten out of the mix. That's a little trickier. But when we look at this, this is not a new thing that's happening, that people are being pushed into countries where they don't belong. The Kalergi plan, for instance, in Europe, and the widespread population replacement happening throughout Europe and throughout was attempted in the United States, happening in Canada, where I believe they're going to be taking 2 million people a year into a country which cannot absorb that. I mean, it's amazing to imagine this, and I think of it because I live very near the Canadian border. But that country up there, which was a 98% white country 20 years ago, is on pace now with no historical precedent to be a majority-minority country by 2040. And that was no accident. And so we should go ahead and call this out wherever it happens, and nations need to start taking charge of their borders. And even more than that, close down immigration from places they do not want it. With respect to the United States, that means ending the visa lottery, ending chain migration. And I would even go so far very happily to say we should have a moratorium on new immigration, as well as on having refugee placement. It's unfortunate that terrible things happen, but let's be really honest. Our warfare state played a role in that. And it's sort of like I was saying earlier, how government ends up presenting itself as the solution to the problems it deliberately creates. I was a Ron Paul guy back in 2008 and 2012. I actually worked for the campaign as a state coordinator for a while, and we understood that. And I think there is a growing awareness that war, does not serve the interests of the people, not our people, not the people we invade, and it certainly hasn't improved anywhere we've gone. What it is it's the health of the state. And it's no accident America, which has been subverted for the last 100 years, gets into a war every, generation. So our best men exhaust their energies overseas, and we fight these wars, which aren't even wars to win, but police actions since World War II, really, that only seem to be of negligent benefit. So I'm sort of wandering afield, but I'm doing it to say just this, that the refugee crisis is the latest manufactured example. I think we should make sure they don't cross the border. And I think Trump is doing one very clever thing, which is that the Republicans in the House and Senate seem unwilling or unable to support what he needs to do on immigration. So I suspect he's using trade as a lever through which to use Mexico as a shield against the migration, which is really being driven out of Central America and points southward. I think that's very smart. It's very canny, and it's a sad commentary on our leadership on the Hill, that we have to have a president use a foreign power do what our Congress should naturally know is their responsibility, in which on a bipartisan basis they did before the Obama administration, or at least they acted as if they did.
Right. So now Mexico is not only going to pay for the wall, but they're going to defend it too.
Well, I tell you the truth, the cheapest wall that Mexico could build is on its own southern border. And Mexico wants to have a good trade relationship with the United States. It would be much more effective. I mean, the cost of Mexican labor is infamously low. Maybe there's a deal there to be made, and maybe Trump can solve the problem that way. A lot of people don't know the history of what NAFTA did and how all those Mexicans ended up on the border. What really happened in 1991 was this. The American government subsidizes the corn market. Those people who vote in Iowa, with 4 different types of subsidies, where basically you cannot lose money growing corn unless you're really trying to. So when NAFTA was designed, the United States dumped all of its cheap corn in the same way that China dumps cheap gadgets on us, on Mexico. And what it did was it destroyed the traditional industry, which if you've ever had Mexican food, is tortillas and whatnot, of southern Mexico. And what that caused was a mass, wide-scale movement of people, and they went ahead and built the maquiladoras, the little cheap, crappy factories on the border, thinking that NAFTA would be of benefit to them. And when the Mexican people actually tried to have standards and whatnot, they moved them to China, and then I think they're in Southeast Asia now. But what people fail to realize is that American policy, specifically American trade policy, really was what caused the big wave that started in the 90s, reshaping how immigration went. There were always agrarian workers, of course, and I don't want to underestimate any of those waves because, once again, that's an American trade policy. But if we had adopted a different policy or adopt one now where we said, hey, we're either going to use automation or we're going to use vocational training for our own people and let wages rise if they need to and costs rise on food or agriculture. But instead, even Trump is going out there because on some level he's signaling, saying we need a bunch of H-1B visas to go ahead and bring in these people. And anyone who's ever dealt with corporations know that they cheat for cheap labor. So you end up with this situation where the economics is always undercutting the cultural integrity. And I think that's the battle of the current Republican Party. Is it going to be the free market, libertarian-driven sort of economic entity it was since, I'd say, the 1970s? Or is it alternatively going to go ahead and be a nationalist party that is sort of peace through strength and not involved? And there's a history of that. And there was a big fight in the 50s, and you can read about Robert Taft and his fights against the Rockefellers and then Goldwater later. But this is actually a tradition that existed on the American right. And until Bill Buckley and his guys over there at National Review kind of torpedoed the efforts of the Birchers and some of these people who've been defamed, like Joe McCarthy, there was an actual right worth speaking of. And now that's recurring now that the internet has churned up a bunch of things that were thought forgotten, but where people are looking at it with fresh eyes and being like, maybe history isn't what we were told in America as well as other places.
Yeah, well, what do you think are some of the more effective kinds of propaganda? We know what the neoliberal order is using, right? Basically the same thing they've used for decades is the mainstream media to drill things into people's heads, newspapers, comedy, like Saturday Night Live skits or whatever, movies, entertainment. So, this kind of ties into really what I'm doing, I think, as an artist is someone who's an artist and is pro-white, standing up against anti-white hatred. What do you think are the things that you would like to see that would be effective in, switching this paradigm and this resistance that's this immune system that's been built up to fight off any white identity politics? I guess, are there things that would open people up, if not necessarily to outright white nationalism, at least some kind of strength on the border, get them to generally be in support of that?
That's a great question. I think that people in movement need to think of what we're doing as an insurgency. And I highly recommend people read books on asymmetrical warfare, fourth generation warfare. And basically it says this, that it's like the Vietnam-Afghanistan example. There's no way the Vietnamese army or the Afghan army or the Taliban can resist the American military. So you find a way to fight a battle you can win. And in this sense, with the cultural war we're fighting in the United States, I would argue for a sort of judo-type strategy of employing the opponent's strength against them. The reality is, anytime we go out and try to do a positive articulation of what we believe, we get chastised and castigated with the usual slanders and slurs that scare people away because the left has the ability to enact violence and or consequences against us. Come out as a pro-white advocate or a hardcore nationalist, you won't get hired, you won't get promoted, and you very well may get fired. In fact, you will if you're in a publicly prominent position, which I was. However, they do have a message that they get to put out there, and their message is complete garbage. So the best thing that we can do, in my opinion, right now, recognizing our fundamental weakness, but also recognizing their lunacy, is to call out their craziness as hypocrisy and mock it relentlessly. I think the two most effective memes in the last 12 months were that it's okay to be white, because every time they go nuts about it's okay to be white, that causes a moment where a white person is asking this existential question. Well, why are they mad with them saying it's okay to be white? Is it not okay to be white? And when you get that break, that moment of cognitive dissonance where you realize that, wait, if they think that, what else do they think about me? And there's always that moment where it starts. The other one I think has been very helpful is the NPC meme, because literally it shows that they are a bunch of sheep, and the left cannot stand to think they are not intellectual heavyweights. They think because they read the New York Times or the Washington Post and watch MSNBC that they're bright and they're brilliant. But the truth is they just repeat the company line, and they are no longer the counterculture. They have not been the counterculture for at least 30 years, and we are. We're the ones with fresh ideas, fresh openings, and as long as we continue to push that, people will gravitate to us. And I think when you look at the inroads that people are making in Generation Z, where traditional morality is actually coming back a little bit, that we're having some success. So take what you're doing, for instance, with cartoons, where you can caption and editorialize. People love to laugh. People love to have a good time. And to be honest with you, Saturday Night Live was once a fresh, hip show about 50 years ago. Now it's something old boomers watch so that they can, feel like they're still relevant. But the reality is, if you're not allowed to poke fun at anybody, you probably can't laugh very much. And so we have a definite possibility to reach out to people and say, look, okay, you don't necessarily agree with everything we think, but come on, this is a load of crap. You know it, I know it, and we know it. And the one thing that is true about people, that is an apolitical thing, but it's absolutely true, is people abhor hypocrisy. And the left practices it in spades because of how they're organized. If we call that out, I think nationalism will be very successful. And to be honest with you, it's an argument we don't make often enough, because realistically, the left always says that take care of everyone except your own people. And I don't think people like that. And whether you define that in racial terms or just strictly moral terms, the argument remains just as true. And I think a well-articulated argument shows that there's a lot of overlap between those two different prisms of looking at things.
Yeah, you probably couldn't see it, Tom, but on the screen I was showing a picture of something that I illustrated. This hasn't been released yet, so this is a preview, a sneak peek. But basically, I illustrated something using a clip that Tom was from a different interview of yours, and so yeah, there's a man there who kind of he's like a gray man, but he's European, and then at the very bottom you've got like these NPC guys who are saying racist bad, equality good. Yeah, so you will that'll come out this week, and
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I mean, let's be honest. Take someone like, since we're talking about that, I mean, I assume you've seen a Murdoch show before. As one example. I mean, that stuff is legitimately hilarious, and yeah, it's offensive, and yeah, it's edgy, and maybe it does go too far. But in a time where we're not allowed to say anything, people, should do that. And I think it's awesome you're doing that. I love the idea of doing lampoons, and I wish I could see it. I just don't want to mess up the Skype connection by bringing up YouTube, because I'm doing this on myself. Eventually. I look forward to it. And, if you want, one thing I haven't mentioned, but I should for the listeners, I run a website also called pendulum.online, where we have 10 different authors of people who are activists in the movement and big thinkers. Every 2 weeks, we cycle through big questions related to white identity. And it's kind of a more serious take on things. But, I love humor. And if you want, as you put some of the stuff together, we'd love to insert some of that. So consider it an open offer to get on there, and we get surprisingly good viewership. So we definitely want to help promote that. And I think, bringing that humor into the mix is something that we desperately need. And look, it shows we can laugh at ourselves. We have to be able to laugh at ourselves, because if not, we're going to go insane. This is not a high odds proposition we're trying to do. It's just the fight we have to do, because if not, we get replaced and it gets horrible. So somehow we'll figure out how to succeed. It's the American way.
Right.
I don't know what it looks like yet, but we're talking about it between you, I, and a lot of people with a lot of IQ and a little bit of courage. We'll get there.
Well, that's it. It makes me think when you bring up humor and everything. I wonder if sometimes humor is I think we have to be careful about. Yes, we want to ridicule the other side, but we don't want to make them seem impotent, because we still want to acknowledge that they have power. And I think that's why the NPC meme is really effective, is because it makes you think of zombies, right? It's like these zombies that are just coming at you, and they're all repeating the same thing. Orange man bad. But
exactly. Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do,
Yeah.
It's the truth.
Yeah. So yeah.
But it's frustrating. But I think the point you make is well put. That part of mocking them is understanding that they have absolute power. And I hate to say it, but sometimes history is the best example. There's a lot of propaganda out there showing how to make fun of these people, like they made fun of commissars and dictators. And we can do that where we demonstrate that they have power, but that they use it arbitrarily, not to the benefit of the people. And whether you are, a fan of democracy, republics, monarchists, whatever your personal political philosophy is, I think the one thing everyone agrees about is no one likes capricious use of power that doesn't serve a larger end, other than the the venial needs of the person exercising it. And we see that so often on the left. It's absolutely disgusting. I mean, corruption alone is something we don't talk about enough. Americans, I think, want to know that government is fair, and the left talks about fairness a lot, but they don't deliver it. And it's sort of a different thing than what you're talking about with humor. But I have a theory that we really haven't seen a 21st century political campaign yet that employs social media in a useful way. I mean, Trump uses it a little bit with Twitter and making certain comments, but could you imagine a candidate that was throwing out memes, effectively and working within a social media matrix, not where you have a top-down rigid campaign structure, but where there was a flow and a give and take where someone could operate in the social media sphere? And we haven't seen that largely because campaigns are worth hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of consultants and businesses and polling. But the reality is, I think polling is highly overrated. People respond to things that make sense to them, and they respond to a personality they believe is sincere. And I think you're going to start to see this change. And as it does, we're going to be in a brand new world where, just like social media has shown, it's authenticity and connectivity that matters to people, not, being above the people, being amongst them and understanding that. And if we're sort of struggling through the mud right now, but we're learning how to swim in this. And when we get into clearer waters, I think the muscles we're developing now are really going to allow this movement to do a lot, because we already have logic and passion. We just don't have resources and support. And that's something that a person like I or other leaders in the movement go ahead and work on, because we recognize there are people like yourself and people doing that who just aren't getting the support they deserve. Whereas if you were a leftist communist, you'd probably have your own website where someone would send you, $50,000 a year to post whatever inane scribblings you have, because that's the reality of it. So we kind of need to support our own, sort of circle on the wagons and realize that we're in a fight against these people, a fight we need to win. And, anyone who is broadly with us, it can be our ally. And I think the other problem we've had is because we've been out of power so long, in terms of culture, not necessarily politics, that we have a lot of people in movement who take very extreme positions because they figure there's no consequence, because they're not going to succeed anyway, and it's a social safety valve for them that they can let it out. And hopefully we will see in the future a push more, I don't want to say towards professionalization, but an understanding that as much as everyone hates to talk about optics, they do matter to some extent, and that there are more people who arise who can go ahead and do three things. Number one, talk intelligently about nationalism. Number two, correspond with people who are right of them without disowning them and doing that whole ridiculous dance of saying that I'm going to virtue signal against someone who doesn't believe some specific issue about some specific group. And thirdly, say to the left, look, I'm going to attack you guys. You're the threat to me. I'm not worried about, nationalist guy or libertarian guy or constitutionalist guy or even people who take, harder third wave views, because those aren't the guys who are destroying this world. It's like, I'll give you an example. I go on David Duke's show, right? And if you go on David Duke's show, you're told he's the worst pariah ever. Who'd he kill? Hillary Clinton killed a lot of people. She's made a national hero. Barack Obama said, I'm good at killing people. He gets statues put after him. David Duke went to one meeting about a pro-Southern group that was admittedly a poor choice probably for his political career, but that's what they do down there. It's how they think. I get that. And yet he's buried underneath it. So if you're just willing to say, and I think this is what Trump has taught us, I think Ron Paul did it beforehand, I think Pat Buchanan did, say, look, I'm not agreeing to your terms. I'm going to talk to whomever I want to, and I'm going to disagree or agree and have these conversations, but you're not going to tell me who I am, who I can vote for, who I can support, or that my people are not welcome. And, if we start to do that in the white population, we will find strength and courage, because the reality is we're still 60% of the population. If white identity awakened tomorrow, we could control this country in 10 minutes. So our weakness is sort of an illusion of how our enemies have taught us to think of ourselves. And it's something that we can and should undo. And every time we put another crack in that windshield, that's one more person who wakes up. And what I've learned from doing this is that once people are awakened, whatever the specific issue is, and it's different for everybody, you can't just go back to sleep. You can't just pretend to not see, the race agenda, the mixing agenda, the immigration agenda is the same way, because you know too much. And even if you want to, and even if you kind of pretend it's in your life, and people do, for a lot of good and bad reasons, you really can't. And so there is a constituency out there that I believe is tens of millions of Americans who understand this, and they're just waiting for leadership to emerge. And that exists on a lot of different levels, including the cultural one.
So obviously today the victim mentality is very, it's been expanded, and it's usually not our people who are using it. We see it with everything from slavery to smallpox blankets to the Holocaust, and it's just like it seems like all these other groups are trying to ramp up their victim status. And unfortunately, we live in a culture and I think also are raised in a way that something plugs into people's minds where, if you're a victim, suddenly you're elevated above other people. You get to cut to the front of the line. So I'm wondering, in terms of, white people, we've really been victimized, I think legitimately. How do we, tell people that all of these things that have happened to us without appearing as if we're basically playing the victim, or we're playing it up? Because immediately when you every time you mention something that's being done that's anti-white, someone comes up and they're like, oh, poor white man, and they just ridicule us.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because you're playing to their strength. That's how they like to play.
Right. But I think it plays to something in white people too, where they're like, oh, I don't want to say that I'm a victim. There's something like that's an anathema to them. And
well, let me take white out of it. Let me ask the question in reverse, and let's see what we come out with. If you saw someone who was, let's just say he's a kid being bullied, right, all the time, and he's told he shouldn't have pride and he should feel ashamed, what is the solution? How would you try to rehabilitate that child? If it was just a child on a playground who was getting beat up.
Well, I would, frankly, I would look for his parents and try to ask them some questions, maybe, because I think that people get bullied because they don't feel like there's anyone in their life who's gonna stand up for them. basically.
Sure. Well, let me give you a different take on that, which maybe is an older take, but my dad was kind of a tough guy. And he told me he had two rules. I don't want you starting any fights, and I don't want you losing any fights. And they might seem contradictory, but they weren't. Because what my dad was trying to teach me, I think, and what our people need to learn is that we don't need to back down from lies that are said about us. And the lie that's told about white people is that we are these terrible, horrible people. But let's be honest. We are the only people in civilizational history who invited other people to come into our country as guests. We are the only people that chose to share our generosity and technology, awareness, civilization with everyone else. Were mistakes made? Of course they were made, but we made the effort. And not only did we make the effort, we built civilization. We've gone to outer space. We've gone ahead and cut the frontiers of technology, of science. So when people say, how do you feel about being white? I don't go out there and talk about how we're a victim. I talk about the pride we should feel and how good we should feel and how we should stand up and argue against the left. And this is that whole quality versus quantity thing. I am a proud child of Europa, of Western civilization, and of the white race. And I feel no shame whatsoever for being white. And I will be honest with you, I feel that no other group, if any other group wants to have pride in their accomplishments and they can quantify them, great. People who have pride and have self-worth, have dignity, respect, and can negotiate with one another from a sense of logic, of fairness, and of mutual concern. That is what a nationalist is. It says, I am not against the Englishman who loves England, or the Polak who loves Poland, or the Japanese man who loves Japan. I respect that, but you are not me. I am not you. We can be different and be happy to celebrate those differences. That false canard of diversity you hear from the left is meaningless when they try to make everyone into everyone else and say none of it matters. Assert our distinctions, stand up for equalities. And to use my bully scenario, if people want to take a shot at you, you take a shot back at them. And I will tell you, and I've faced down the national media before, so I know this. The one thing that pissed them off more than anything else is I would never apologize. And I'm not going to apologize when I'm right. Will people pay a consequence for this? Yes, they do. But every just man who goes down, honestly, is a bit like the old blood of the martyrs that drove Christianity. If enough just people are persecuted, that's when people in our movement will start to listen and realize we can't give in anymore. And that's what I think we need to do. And I understand people have to be smart. They have to be careful. They have to think of their families. I'm not asking people to do more than they can. But what I am saying is be willing to call out BS when you know it is what it is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of one of those things. Nobody wants to be a martyr, but at the same time, martyrs are very good propaganda, very good things for pushing.
And I will tell you, to be honest with you, look, I'm on the other side. I lost my job. I got fired. My life is better now. I get to talk about what I love. I'm fortunate to have some people who help enable that, and the people who buy my books. It's incredibly helpful. And we need a movement that takes care of our own. The leftists take care of their own. If you're a leftist who does something awful, not only will the courts not prosecute you, the judges and juries will find you not guilty if you even get taken to trial. You'll get a job the next day. We need to build a movement where we take care of our own. And that's why the biggest thing I focus on, honestly, is infrastructure and working with people in leadership positions to build things so that people who go out there and say things, they know they'll have a place to land. And that's where we need to get to. I think that's what we need to do during Trump. Trump is a respite that is allowing us time to organize. We need to organize smart. We need to organize competitively, and we need to organize positively behind this sort of thing. But I don't think of us as victims. I just think we've forgotten our own strength, and I understand why that's happened. But we're like an elephant looking in a funhouse mirror, thinking we're a mouse. We could trample these people in 20 minutes. And everyone knows it because, if you read any of the literature and movement, how everyone fetishizes a collapse, right? Because they think, oh, well, then we'll be able to fight and then we'll get something. Why can't we harness those same energies now? Because we're not willing to talk about it, because we're scared of losing our material comforts. Understand that political power always comes with a price. And the left has been winning because they are willing to pay that price. Until or unless we are willing to do the same thing, we will not succeed. And sadly, I hate to say, because they are using political power to drive cultural mores, we need to step up to that level. The good news is people are starting to realize and be pushed to the point where they see that. And as more people awaken, and will be forced to be awakened by the policies the left themselves will push into power, a moment will come when we have the opportunity to contest them. We're probably just a little bit ahead of that. And I think Trump's success forestalled that for one extent. And the other thing was, it was a bit of an olive branch from the right to the left to say, hey, we could have civic nationalism. We could have everyone succeed, and to try to make the deal in a more muscular form that the right has offered to the left since basically 1965, which is, if we just meet you halfway, will you have peace with us? But as we've seen over and over again on every issue, from gay marriage to abortion to guns to the border, we meet them halfway, and then they get another halfway closer, another halfway. And their people are so used to winning that they're just not going to give anything up. And that was what happened when you try to be nice to people who aren't. It's like, honestly, inviting a parasite into your house. That's what we did, and now we got to kick them out. And whatever that takes to put us on sane footing is something I would support.
Yeah, a friend of mine the other day said something kind of profound that stuck with me. And he said, because he actually quit his job, and it was he was in a job that was very multicultural, and he couldn't take it. It was very claustrophobic. The only people with testosterone were like Muslims and stuff.
Sure.
And yeah, so like he quit his job, and he said it was the most freeing thing he could have done, because he was living in owned space. And I think that we have to try to not put ourselves in those kind of situations where we're living by other people's rules. And it is tough in this day and age when so much of the technology and the infrastructure, it's all really coalesced towards the top, and the rich own so much of a percentage of the wealth. But we can't just we can't waste our time, I think, being sort of kind of like slaves, essentially, just living by these other people's rules. And
True. I think one thing that has really exacerbated that too, and this was sort of inevitable, is economic specialization. The fact that people, are trained to be an accountant, an auditor, a lawyer, a chemist, whatever they're trained to, they're stuck in a system where they can't provide for themselves independently. And to people who are concerned about being trapped in that sort of area, I would highly recommend considering, that you can find independent work. You could do manual labor. You could be a tradesman. And, no one cares what the plumber thinks. No one cares what the electrician thinks. And pound for pound, you won't have to go through all that, psychological conditioning at the university. You won't get yourself tens of thousands of dollars in debt. You will have a life skill that people will care for. You'll be able to earn a decent wage, and you'll be able to live life on your own terms. If you're an intellectual, obviously that's a little bit harder. You have to find and steal your niche. It's not impossible. It's not easy. I do it. But I wouldn't. It's not for everybody, and I understand that. But you can find ways to exist outside the system. Move to the country instead of the city. I live in a rural area of Maine, and I've lived in rural areas of New England, but I didn't grow up there. I grew up in a nondescript suburb in Phoenix. I lived in cities for many years. I've seen that life, and that life forces you to give up that space you're talking about around you, where you get to be a human being. And there's nothing more meaningful in life than time and having the dignity of living true to your beliefs. So find the way to do it. And if you need to plan for it. But you can land. And I tell you, it's absolutely worth it. Your friend had absolutely the right idea. And you're going to find, as you get to places where people are freer, more people who think like you do. I wrote that book most recently, The Coming Civil War, where I was talking about where and how the right might organize resistance. And, for as much as we talk about race race and we talk about ideology, the biggest division in America isn't either of those. It's between rural people and city people. Rural people who still kind of know how to live on their own and don't want government telling them how to live, and city folk who basically demand government micromanages every aspect of their lives. And if you don't want to live that way and you want to start building a new way to live for yourself, I recommend taking a look out there and give it an opportunity. I did, my wife did, and it was an adjustment, obviously, but it has been the best decision we've made in our lives.
Did you go full like Alex Jones off the grid type of thing?
I haven't, but I wouldn't mind going closer to that. I mean, I've slaughtered my own food before, and I know that's something that sounds scary to people, but realistically, if you're going to eat it, you ought to know how to make it. And if the power goes out, I have 3 or 4 different ways to turn it back on. So if things go badly, I'm pretty sure we'll survive. And if things go well, I have a whole bunch of really cool skill sets. People look down on people like that. But homesteaders are best friends, for instance. They live off the land. They make their own food. They do that. They don't give a damn what the government says to them. And I will say they're heavily armed as well. So if anything ever happens to them, they're ready. They are living life on their own terms. Is there a price to that? Yeah, they work 12, 14 hours a day. They bust their tail ends, but they're free. And so you have to ask yourself, if you're liberty, what price you're willing to pay for it. And that's the question, which sadly we find as long as our material comforts are satisfied, most of our people are not willing to pay very much at all. And we have a whole lot of armchair revolutionaries who aren't willing to do things. But politics is a test of wills. So if you keep thinking of the future as something that, it's going to be what 50% plus one wants, the left is going to win, and they're going to have their egalitarian utopia, which will become Venezuela, which will become the Soviet Union, and maybe our great-great-grandkids will have the courage to revolt against it. Alternatively, we could do something and organize ourselves, but it requires people to be willing to step outside their system. And whether they're baby steps or big old jumping steps, what you find is once you start walking that path, you start to like the walk.
Well, and if you have a bit more time, I know you originally had a project. Was it New Albion?
I did. I do. Yeah, New Albion was an effort. It's actually a continuing effort undercover, as it were, to organize people in support of traditional values and identity here in northern New England, in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And we maintain a sizable, friendly network of people up here. We are the 3 of the 4 whitest states in America, West Virginia being number 3 that's outside of us, but Maine is the whitest, then followed by New Hampshire, and I believe Vermont is number 4, although I might have those 2 reversed. And we go ahead and we work to develop regional networks between ourselves, reaching out to people. And we have a growing network of people who are sympathetic to us, who broadly understand demography, who support or have a positive view of white identity. And it's been an exciting and useful project. That honestly, the only reason why I don't publicly promote it more is because we decided for the benefit of our members that it was more useful to not draw more attention. But I will tell you, we are gaining numbers, we are gaining strength, and not because of anything that I do, but because people look what these insane leftists are doing and they say, how can we oppose this? And that is really a guide for how things can go in the future. But one thing I always recommend when I come on a podcast is to get to a place you think you'll be safe, where there are more people like you. And if you live in California or, the desert Southwest, like where I grew up, I would recommend that you consider moving as expeditiously as your means allow, because a day may come when your life depends upon where you live. And I know that's a very dire sounding prediction, but America is a country that's reft between 2 cultures that hate each other. And sooner or later, a crisis will arise which will expose that division in a way which the people themselves will be unable or unwilling to cover. And I think relying on a government that's largely corrupt and inefficient in many ways is a very dangerous bet for people to make.
Well, yeah, I mean, people focus on guns, and thankfully we still have the Second Amendment. but for now. But you know, I think having, you know, like a group of 5 guys or 5 families is basically the equivalent of having a whole stockpile of weapons, and you know.
Absolutely, you are your
choose.
friends. Absolutely, and you can have it both ways. You know, for instance, I know a network of let's say we have 20 families. I don't want to get into raw numbers, but we have people with different skill sets, people who can produce food, people who have their own electricity, people who have different mechanical skills. We're going to be in good shape, and I will tell you something. So let's say that one of them loses a job. Everyone can help support that guy, and that's kind of what's nice when you start having that redundancy. You know, if you study the American Revolution, for instance, a little bit, you start to realize the reason it happened is because people were self-sufficient farmers who could basically live off the land wherever they needed to. And our people don't have that, and we kind of need some confidence. So even if you're someone who lives in a city, right, and who has a regular job, do something on the weekend. Go hike. Go develop a physical skill or some strength or something for confidence, you know. I mean, get into the real world too. That's the other thing. I mean, as much time as I spend on social media and the internet, I mean, honestly, whenever I walk away from that, I tear the 4 hairs left of my head off because I end up talking to someone whose you know, inability to understand basic facts drives me insane. But if you go out to the real world, you go out to nature, you see these things, you'll start to feel better. And I think that's useful. I mean, I think people need to recognize this is going to be a long fight, not a short, you know, battle, most likely. And, you know, don't overextend yourself. You know, I've been a long political type, and, you know, people burn out. They go hot and heavy for 6 months, and then the revolution doesn't happen, and they quit. And then, you know, they live in suburbia with 2.3 kids and a cockatoo. Find something between here and there, you know?
Right. Maybe to keep the kids, but you don't need the cockatoo.
Yeah, well, you know, birds are tough, man. Birds are tough. My wife used to have one. She has snakes now, though. They're even tougher, but that's another story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I just had another question for you. Let me think. Okay, yeah. So in summary, like your book, The Coming Civil War, it's a bit fantastical. It's a bit maybe of hyperbole. But I think you're talking about like a social breakdown. Rather like that seems to be the situation you're describing, rather than just like all out warfare where like another civil war, right?
Well, I mean, just out of curiosity, have you had a chance to read the book?
No, I haven't. Sorry.
All right, so I will send you a PDF of the book, and I will tell you honestly, I don't think it's hyperbolic at all. I think we're sleepwalking into it. In the same way, if people want to see a scenario that is similar, look at the breakup of the Soviet Union into its constituent states. Look at the breakup of Yugoslavia. It's not that different. When you start having radical cultural Marxist ideology, which is what we have, where you have basically people paying for people to not work, what ends up happening is at some point the system collapses under its own weight, and with the absence of government legitimacy, other actors rise, including violent ones, and people not knowing where to go line up along different identities they can trust, whether it be ethnic, whether it be regional, local, whatever. And I honestly think America is far more in danger than people realize. Now, in the book, I talk about 6 scenarios of how it could go, 3 which I don't think are very likely, but we'll cover the 3 likely ones. One is submission, which is to say the left wins the culture war because everyone decides peace is better than fighting and that we get replaced. I think the odds are 1 in 2 pretty much that happens. I think there's maybe a 10% chance that someone rises from the right to go ahead and take power and to make nationalism mean something. But I think there's about a 40% chance that what happens is, you know, activists get confused and something ends up spiraling out of control. You look at the history of how World War I started, for instance, with the assassination of the Austrian prince by a Serbian anarchist, and how basically that leads to a war where many millions of people die because everyone was acting rationally, and the whole thing ended up being an irrational mess. I honestly believe we have a very real chance of that happening, and I strongly encourage people to read the book and see, and then you decide for yourself 400 pages later if you think it's something that's realistic. Because of the fact that you don't need a lot of people to agree with it. You only need about 5% on each side willing to go ahead and do something. And the left already has that 5%. You see how Antifa has free reign. You see how they're not held to account by the courts because they're now basically serving as a de facto deep state paramilitary militia. This is the reality we have on the ground. It is a dangerous thing. It looks a lot like Germany in the 20s did. We don't know how it's going to go. And a lot of countries in Europe went kind of hardcore nationalist or communist at that point. I think we're coming to a point that's going to be like that because as our demographic shift continues, I don't think minorities are going to temper their demands in terms of what they want for their socialist majority. And I don't imagine a bunch of white gun owners are going to decide all of a sudden to give them more when they're more mad at all they've already taken. And so I would encourage people to consider very carefully that the future may be far more dangerous than people presume. And if it happens, it's going to come quick. And it won't be very predictable because, as I've said in many other cases, we have a broken culture, and a culture which is broken will not have the resilience to deal with any disaster, be it natural or artificially induced. And when you see, like, post-Katrina, the breakdown that happened in New Orleans, it's just a microcosm of what is waiting to happen if a big enough event strikes America. And it will happen because it always does historically, whether it be a plague, whether it be, economic collapse, whatever it is. And then you're going to have to think, do you trust your fellow citizen? And if your answer is no, then you better be ready to fight because that's what's going to happen.
Okay, I think I remember where I wanted to steer you is Christianity, because I know you've talked about religion and stuff. And here's a good segue because if you don't have like a God, what you're saying just seems that might be why I was saying it was hyperbolic or something. For most people, it does really seem that way. The libertarians for a long time, they've been calling for like doom and because basically what cannot continue mathematically will not continue. And so, but the Peter Schiffs.
Do you know why
the
libertarians get it wrong? What is the inherent value of a fiat dollar?
Oh, nothing.
So if you produce an infinite number of new dollars, how much actual wealth are you creating?
Nothing.
So what's to prevent you from putting out there $2 trillion in new currency? So long as people give it social currency, that is to say they accept it and treat it like it has value, and the whole emperor has new clothes scenario, there's no fundamental top limit to what they can do to get out of a debt crisis or to get out of the fact that spending. I mean, just so much of the debt. Okay, so the libertarian model of what's going to happen is that the debt crisis will cause a collapse, but these countries all owe debt to each other and to the central banks. They can cancel and use debt as a weapon as much as they want. And that's why the collapse the libertarians always predicted never happens and never will happen, because people will work twice as hard for the fake money rather than face the reality of a collapse. They've been able to string us along indefinitely, and they would be able to. The problem is you can't do that with culture, because whereas economics are about money and they're about a continuum of numbers that range from high to low, culture is about divisions. It's about truths that contradict one another. And now that they've basically created different ethnicities that have different cultural truths, we can no longer coexist. One has to assert primacy over the other. Either we have to surrender it to them, or we have to take it back from them. Now, we may very well surrender, but you can't reconcile Group A, who's saying we're in charge, with Group B, who says we're going to take everything you have and then be in charge. And that's why the crisis is upon us now. It's not the crisis anyone saw coming, because we were indoctrinated, and I include myself in this, to not think in racial terms because we thought race was a done deal. But it changed when we went from a country that was 90% white and 10% minority to a country that's 60% white and 40% minority, and will be even more so in the future. That was the big mistake.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, because I don't know. I'm not the expert on like monetary policy or anything. So,
but it makes sense, doesn't it? Right, that the dollar has no intrinsic value. So why would there be any upper limit of how much you could put out there? And we saw this. The Fed did this quantitative easing, just so people understand. And I'm a little bit of a wonk, so I can explain this hopefully in a useful way. Is basically the Fed hitting the print button on currency to go ahead and make sure that there stays liquidity in the economy. What's that mean? People don't trust the economy, so they start hoarding cash. So the banks artificially put out more money because the Fed gives them money for free. That's what its 0% interest rate means, to put out in there to make sure that money stays in circulation. I mean, and I think people can appreciate this, even though theoretically technology advances us and makes things cheaper. You notice how prices always seem to escalate bit by bit over time. That's the unmarked cost you see of inflation, where basically you see the Fed propping up an economy that has no intrinsic value in terms of the US dollar, and in terms, up until recently, how Obama and the left, not just the left though, I think Bush is just as guilty of how the economy was mismanaged basically for 20 years.
Right.
But it's interesting because if you understand the history of the Fed, it's the oldest scam in history. What they do is they put out a bunch of debt. They take your assets as collateral in exchange for money. And then when the collapse happens and you can't pay because the prices go, one direction or the other, they gain control of the assets, which is, if you study the history of the Federal Reserve, it was created in 1913 to theoretically prevent the sort of thing that happened with the Great Depression. But the Great Depression functionally consolidated all the wealth in America into fewer hands, because what it did was it took that debt, the toxic debt, and converted it into assets for the banks and the people who owned the banks. And it's no accident. This happens again and again throughout history. I mean, I know banking is a boring subject, but you cannot understand how our culture has been subverted until you understand the history of banking. And I highly recommend people read about the Rothschilds. And if you've never read The Creature from Jekyll Island, it's a classic by G. Edward Griffin. It helps explain. I've met the man. He's brilliant. It's definitely will make you rethink how you look at the world and how the scam has been perpetuated. Because you have to remember, before 1913 and the Federal Reserve, two things were true in America. We didn't have a federal income tax, and we didn't have a central bank. Andrew Jackson almost died to fight the central bank. Abraham Lincoln was attacked for putting greenback notes. And people who've studied it think Jack Kennedy may very well have been died for trying to put treasury notes out there against the bank. You can criticize anything you want. You can call any group whatever you want. But if you want to get yourself on a list, go ahead and talk about centralized banking. Those people are the ones who end up dead. You could ask Muammar Gaddafi if you want, except they impaled him.
Oh yeah, don't some people think that that was why they went after Kennedy, JFK?
Sure. It's Executive Order 11110. I recommend people look it up. And Kennedy has a very interesting speech about secret societies about 2 weeks before he dies. It's a matter of public record.
Yeah, super important.
The rabbit hole just gets deeper. But to go back to the point you were trying to make, I think
Christianity
having faith,
and religion.
Yeah, Christianity and religion. I know a lot of people in movement take shots at Christianity. I understand why they do it. Christianity adapts to its times, and it was one of the first things subverted. I think people would do well to see how cultural Marxism got in there. The influence of the Schofield Bible, for example, but understand that Christianity has been the most effective form of deliverance and expansion for the European and Western peoples historically. And I think it uniquely, how should I put it, immunizes us against the threat of radical equality, because we recognize as Christians that by living virtuous lives that in fact we realize a fuller equality in the hereafter. And I think that within that, of course, there is the universalism of saying all men have souls, but the recognition that we are different nations as God intended us, and the understanding that just because, we have empathy with the suffering of people elsewhere doesn't mean we want to admit them into our homes. And that people who want to do things charitably can do so. And, as Christ himself said, give unto Caesar what's Caesar's and give unto Christ what's Christ's. I think that's a very valuable insight. And I think that the Christians have unfortunately been impugned by this movement far too often, to the detriment of both the movement in terms of the people who don't learn from the biblical lessons, as well as our ability to reach a much larger audience. The truth is, amongst the white population, amongst nationalists generally, Christians are by far the largest bloc. So when you go around there screaming it's a Semitic religion with a bunch of apologists, I think it does a ton of harm. And I think, unfortunately, it's one more sign of the success of the enemy's propaganda in dividing us against people who should be our natural allies.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it, that Christianity is malleable, and it's don't get mad at Christianity, get mad at the people who are subverting it and try to fight back against that. I'm kind of thinking that at least the Protestantism that we have, or a lot of the religions that are out there, maybe even Catholicism, I'm not even sure that is going to be able to survive. But, I had a certain stint through Mormonism, and I found it really interesting that this guy, Joseph Smith, just created a new Christian religion. And I could totally see something like that being a way forward.
There is going to be, when you look within the Christian churches, who gets the most people attending their services and who has the healthiest rate is the fundamentalist beliefs that focus on uncompromising morality and that focus on family and community. And I think that's a way forward. And I think the sort of big institutional churches that we see are very well funded have taken their 30 pieces of silver. And if you start to trace how that went out there, you find that the people who have subverted them are the same people who are contesting us on political and cultural fronts. So, it's the old thing about it's easier for, I want to make sure I'm not mixing my metaphors. How hard it is for a rich man to get into heaven. It's not the money, it's the sacrifices you make for the money and the things you're willing to sell. And that we need to be guided by clear understanding and morality in that. And there is a long understanding of that. And in the American context, I would say specifically, one thing I hope happens is that people once understood America as a New Jerusalem and that we were the fulfillment of the promise of God to his people. And I think we've seen the subversion into that, where Christianity now serves other interests, whether it be Zionism, dispensationism. And I think that model, although well-funded and virtue signaled, is not the model successful, but rather something more akin, maybe a little bit more Calvinist flavor, where, we realize there is an elect, that we have to fight for it, and that we're going to have to do things. And while I don't know what that's going to look like in the future, the one thing I have said publicly and that I personally think is, even though I get along fine with pagans and whatnot, that is not the pathway forward for our people. It wasn't the pathway in the 13th century, and it isn't going to be the pathway now, specifically because they lack the faith and the confidence that it's going to be required to not just fight and die, but to live for the day and to bring the optimism, which I think our people really need in this time of our subjugation.
Right. And what I was talking about is really like taking some elements from different things, but at the same time, like, I would like to see something, that is... To give the pagans credit, I agree with you that it's probably not the way forward, but like, to give them credit, at least there is more of an attachment to your race, and I think like embedded in it. And I know that's also in Christianity to some degree, but it is universalized. Like, people should, essentially, people should. It's ethno-nationalism, not white nationalism. In other words, it's more of a universalized thing.
And I think that's better. I mean, I think I don't see the difference as much because, as a nationalist, I respect that other nations have the right to exist. And this is the difference between nationalism and supremacism. I'm just saying that we have a right to have our spaces where we live according to our rules and that we can live in peace and tranquility. It is actually the philosophy of peace to allow people who are different to live with people who are like them, who are different from other people, rather than to force us all together. Honestly, in a lot of ways, the people we have now are like Nimrod building the Tower of Babel. And, when I see those fires in California all the time, a part of me can't help but twinge and think maybe the Lord is trying to send a message. But like I said, I have nothing against people who have different beliefs. And I do think the one thing I agree with the pagan, two things I agree with. One is their focus on moral virtue. I think that's a healthy impulse that should continue. And secondly, like you said, they do have a healthy self-preservation instinct. We need that, but also coupled with the willingness to sacrifice ourselves if it comes to that. And that balance is going to be a difficult one to strike, but it always has been. And as you said, and I agree with, that Christianity is a vehicle that allows for that. And within the larger context of nationalism, specifically white nationalism, I see no reason why we can't get along and work together. And I do regularly with most people in that community, and they with me, because we do understand that, we have to work together for the benefit of this nation. And as a Christian, that requires me to go ahead and sort of sublimate some of those, universal impulses, in the sense of understanding that until I can take care of my home, I can't take care of anyone else. And I think that's a lesson more Christians have to be willing to put out there.
Yeah. What would you tell the atheists? Because there are quite a few people who just say, well, I can't believe in a God even if I wanted to. So what would you tell them? Because obviously you believe that faith is an important component going forward for our people. What would you say? Uh-oh. Did I lose you?
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, I'm sorry. That was my fault. I accidentally hit phone. I was going to say, I talked to a lot of people in Europe who are secular materialist atheists, and I asked them, if all you believe is in this stuff, how are you going to go ahead and contest people who come in here who have a faith they're willing to die for? Like Islam. I mean, and over there, their contest is a little different than ours. But they eat for all their resources and all their knowledge and all their awareness. Without belief, the struggle just isn't the same. And I find that, and I mean, I'm not saying they can't be allies and assets, but that there is a certain unwillingness to invest more than one's own life. Because if you think all there is to this world is your life, then that means that the loss of your life is the end of your being, and that inherently it makes it much harder for one to contemplate a sacrifice. Whereas I see us in the continuous chain of being for the future for our children, both as a moral sense, but also that in the end, I'm going to be held to account for my actions in a way where that is determinative of what happens to me. And so from that perspective, I think that there's an advantage to having faith. And I understand it's not something you can just ask someone to give, but that I genuinely believe faith itself has a transformative impulse, and it makes people willing to take a bigger, broader, and braver picture. And so I would encourage people to seek within themselves, and Lord knows I'm not going to try to defend theology today, but the world is a really improbable place. And entropy being what it is, if the physical laws of being are all that exists, intelligence has a 1 in however many quadrillions chance of existing. So are you willing to bet on the odds of winning Powerball 100 times in a row? Or are you willing to consider the possibility that there might be something more? And it's been my personal experience that many people who are atheistic are really people who have the faith of disappointment, where they choose to believe or testify that they believe there is no God or no possibilities because they were hurt and disappointed about the way the world is. And I totally get that, and I understand that. And I would just ask people who think that way to say, is it really that way, reason that you believe? Because I can't tell you how many atheists I've talked to who, upon confessing, basically admit God failed them in a time where they were suffering. But what I've kind of learned from my own life, and I want to give credit to my wonderful wife, Dana, in this, is my wife has a chronic disease, Lyme disease. It's a condition that's debilitating. She has seizures, heart palpitations, whatever, a whole bunch of terrible things. And she's a hardcore nationalist as well, and a Christian to boot, more of a Christian than a nationalist. And she gets up every day and fights, not knowing if she's going to live or going to die. And she fights with a smile on her face because she has faith. And I've learned from that the suffering has made her stronger, able to endure things. And the bad days have made us treasure the good days. So when people look at our situation and the suffering and the awfulness of the world and say there can't be a God, it's only the bad that teaches us the good. And I wonder and I dream 10 years from now, if we effectuate our liberation, where, that we have positive white identity and our nation restored and our values returned, how much more glorious our victory will be, how sweet that success will be for all the degradation we've suffered now. And in that, I think there's something fair and wonderful and beautiful and that we can aspire to. And I think for people who absent themselves from that sort of conflict and that understanding, which is what I think a person who's lost faith really is, they're missing an opportunity for something so much greater. And I respect that. I'll work with them. I don't try to proselytize, but I think you can hear it in my voice. I genuinely believe this. And, I pray for people like that to find a way to faith. And I know those people because I was one of them once. My faith did not come easy. I didn't go to church when I was a kid. I didn't experience it. And I was pissed off at God for a really long time about the fact that bad things happen to good people way too often. And it took me a really long time to make peace with that, to understand usually when bad things happen, A, we do it to ourselves, and B, we live in a world where we're not guaranteed good outcomes, but that there is a way for rescue and salvation. And I look at that as our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I understand other people look at it differently. I respect that. But in any case, coming to terms with the world as it is a key part of anyone accepting their life. But I think people who can do it with faith have a set of tools, abilities, and possibilities to dream of bigger and better futures that people who do not struggle with.
Right. Well, I think that a lot of it does come down to the fact that these faithless people, they can't see what's coming. And actually having faith can help you to see what's coming, but it is also the impetus to your faith. If
Sure.
You can look ahead and just realize wow, I'm not going to be able to do this by myself. We're not going to be able to do this by ourselves. We need a higher power, if you will.
We need a miracle. Let's start praying,
That's right. That's right.
And you know what? Worst case scenario, it isn't going to hurt. They used to call that Darwin's gamble. I'd rather believe in God than not, because the consequences of being wrong are pretty strong.
I thought that was Pascal's wager.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. I said it backwards. I apologize. I stand corrected. But it is correct. The concept is correct.
Right.
So I think that's a nice place to leave it, actually, for today. And I would be happy to come on again another day if you want. And I want to say thank you for having me on your first show. I appreciated it. And I hope for the people listening who are commenting and who listen to this later, you've enjoyed it. And check out my work at nationalright.us, as well as pendulum.online. You can find any of my books on Amazon, or if you reach me at tom@nationalright.us, I'll get you a signed copy. And take a look, and if you want to find me, I'm on Gab at Tom Kawczynski, and I am notorious for getting into arguments and conversations, which is part of the fun of it, but then we have good discussions and we learn from each other, and we're all in this together, so we need to work with one another.
That's great. Thanks for making this a successful first episode. Love to have you back. How close are you to finishing the book?
Well, the new book is out. It's just, honestly, it's sort of ridiculous. I'll just give you a quick aside. I'm fighting with Amazon because they keep rejecting my cover. I'm fighting with an algorithm, basically, that doesn't like how I formatted my text. And I've now resubmitted it 4 times, which cost me the holiday weekend. Thank you, Amazon. But the book will be out after Trump. The ebook's already out, actually. I'm just waiting for the print copy. But any of that, if you're really interested in everything I put together, reach out to me at Tom at National Right, and I'll give you a bundle deal, and I can get you digital copies real cheap too if you want to read. But it's good writing. It'll give you a lot of tools to use. And one thing I'm told that I'm pretty good at, people in movement anyway think, is that I can talk to people who don't necessarily have the same context we do. I purposely write for a lay audience who is not aware of all these facts that, most of the listeners to your podcast will be. But I think it's important, if you talk from basic principles, that you can reach a lot of people. And it's something I endeavor to do with all my writing.
Great. I look forward to reading more of your work.
Absolutely. And I'm going to give you the coming Civil War, and then I'm going to give you a quiz on it when I come on next time. We'll see what you think after reading it.
Excellent.
Thank you for having me on, Matthew. Have a very nice evening.
Have a good one. Bye.
All right. Bye.
And let me close this Skype thingy. Okay. So thank you guys for the stream. Think we did well this time. Let me know, send me an email, drakeart@protonmail.com. If you want to send me suggestions, here's what I want to know from you. Send me one person to have on the show, one person that you want me to review, critique, and then one thing that you want me to draw on the show, because I also might be doing some live drawing. Also, a reminder to people, stay in the loop, get on my emailing list, because in a month or two, probably, more like 2 months, I'll probably have, that's when the children's book that I've been hyping up will be ready. So, all right, guys, it's been a pleasure, and see you next time.